Ethan Walker never had a problem with his neighbors. That was one of the best things about living on a farm just outside city limits: space, freedom, and the ability to mind his own business without anyone telling him what to do. His land had been in his family for generations, stretching over 50 acres of rolling fields, a sturdy barn that had seen more seasons than most of the houses in town, and pastures filled with chickens, horses, and cattle. Life was simple, peaceful, and exactly the way he wanted it. Then the HOA moved in. A year ago, a developer broke ground on what used to be open fields just past the tree line of Ethan's property. What had once been part of the countryside was now a collection of pristine, identical houses with white fences, manicured lawns, and people who looked like they belonged in a luxury car commercial. They called the place Oak Estates, a name that sounded rustic enough to attract city transplants desperate for the illusion of country living, so long as it didn't come with the smells, sights, or sounds of an actual farm. At first, Ethan didn't mind. People had a right to live wherever they wanted, even if they had no clue what real rural life was like. But as the houses filled up, so did the complaints. It started small, passive-aggressive notes left in his mailbox, comments about how his unkempt property was bringing down the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Then came the visits from city inspectors, questioning his livestock permits, zoning compliance, and even his environmental impact. Someone was filing reports against him. Someone was making it their personal mission to push him out. That someone turned out to be Karen Whitmore. Karen wasn't just another homeowner in Oak Estates, she was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman who clutched the rulebook like a weapon and strutted around as if she were mayor of the countryside. The first time Ethan met her, she was marching up his driveway, clipboard in hand, wearing a crisp white blouse so stiff it looked like it could cut glass. Her smile was tight, plastic, and as fake as the spray-on grass her HOA mandated. "Mr. Walker," she greeted, voice dripping with forced politeness. Ethan, who had been leaning against the fence, arms crossed, didn't bother hiding his disinterest. "That's me." Karen's sharp eyes flicked over his property, scanning everything like she was conducting a federal investigation. Her lips pressed together, as if she had just walked into a crime scene. "We need to talk about your setup here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "My setup?" She exhaled like she was dealing with a stubborn child. "We at Oak Estates take great pride in maintaining a certain aesthetic standard. Your agricultural operation is in direct conflict with that vision." Ethan had to bite back a laugh. "Lady, it's a farm." Karen let out a short, clipped chuckle, like he had made a foolish mistake. "I understand that. But your property borders our community, which means it affects our property values. Surely, you can understand why your facilities might be considered disruptive." Ethan leaned against the fence post, studying her. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about it?" Her eyes lit up, as if she had been waiting for that very question. "We have a list of guidelines you can follow to ensure your property aligns with our community standards. For example, a uniform fence, restrictions on livestock, and of course," she waved a manicured hand at his barn and animals, "a ban on any offensive odors." Ethan blinked. "Offensive odors?" Karen nodded solemnly. "Yes. Manure, livestock feed, other farm-related smells. You see, fresh air is important to our residents." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, trying to decide if she was serious. She was. Letting out a slow exhale, he finally spoke. "Let me get this straight. You're telling me, on my own land, that I can't keep animals, can't have a barn, and can't even let my farm smell like a farm?" Karen beamed. "Precisely. If you cooperate, I'm sure we can come to a mutual understanding." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Then, without another word, he reached for the nearest fence latch, swung open the gate, and gestured toward the road. "I understand perfectly," he said. "Now kindly get off my property." Ethan didn't think much about Karen's visit after she stormed off. heels clicking against the gravel like a furious school principal. He figured she'd file a complaint or two, maybe send another letter, but he had dealt with bureaucratic nonsense before. A few disgruntled suburbanites weren't going to change how he ran his farm. He was wrong. The harassment started subtly. A notice of violation appeared on his fence one morning, stamped with bold red letters warning that his property needed to meet HOA standards. He ripped it down and tossed it into the trash without a second thought. The next day, another one showed up. And then another. City officials began visiting more frequently, citing reports of zoning violations, health concerns, and noise complaints. The first was a livestock inspection. Some anonymous tip had claimed Ethan was exceeding the legal number of animals allowed on his property. The inspector, a tired-looking man with a clipboard, glanced around and sighed. "Mr. Walker, I just need to verify your permits," he said, already looking like he regretted the drive out here. Ethan led him through the property, showing him everything was in order. His cows, chickens, and horses were well within legal limits. By the time the inspector was done, he almost looked embarrassed. "Sorry for the trouble," he muttered. "Looks like a baseless complaint." Ethan smirked. "Let me guess, someone from the HOA, The man didn't confirm it outright, but the way he shifted his weight uncomfortably told Ethan everything he needed to know. The visits didn't stop. 2 days later, a health department official arrived, claiming to be following up on reports of odor violations. The woman barely lasted 5 minutes before rolling her eyes and leaving. His farm smelled like a farm, nothing more. Then came a soil contamination report, then an environmental hazard concern. It became obvious that someone, Karen was filing complaint after complaint, hoping one of them would stick. Ethan was starting to get annoyed. Then, one morning, he walked out to feed the animals and noticed something off. The air smelled wrong, chemical, sharp, unnatural. His stomach turned as he walked to his main crop field, and what he saw made his blood boil. Half of his crops, lettuce, tomatoes, and rows of leafy greens, were dead, shriveled up as if burned from the inside out. He crouched down, running his fingers over the brittle remains, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone had poisoned his land. He forced himself to stay calm. His trail camera, a motion-activated device he had set up to catch wandering deer, might have caught something. He stormed to the barn, yanked out the memory card, and loaded the footage onto his laptop. And there it was. A shadowy figure, moving under the cover of night, spraying something onto his crops. They wore a hood, trying to stay hidden, but the angle was just clear enough. Ethan recognized them. One of Karen's HOA board members. Ethan wasted no time. He drove straight to the sheriff's office and handed over the footage. Within hours, a deputy showed up at the suspect's door, and before the day was over, they were in handcuffs. Karen, of course, denied everything. She claimed she had no knowledge of what her board member had done, that she was appalled by their actions. The suspect, likely hoping to cut a deal, refused to say who had ordered them to do it, but Ethan knew. He knew exactly who was behind it. That night, he made a call to Rachel, his lawyer. "This isn't just some HOA nonsense anymore," he said, his voice tight with anger. She's coming after my livelihood, Rachel was silent for a moment before responding, her voice calm and steady. "Then it's time we start playing offense." Ethan agreed. The next morning, the local news picked up the story. The headline was brutal: farmer targeted in HOA land dispute, suspect arrested for property sabotage. The article detailed how his crops had been poisoned, the endless harassment, and the city inspectors showing up at his door almost daily. A few of the more reasonable HOA members began to question Karen's motives. Some even reached out to Ethan privately, apologizing for the way things had spiraled. But Karen wasn't done. If anything, she was getting desperate. A week later, Ethan opened his mailbox and found an official-looking envelope stamped with an urgent notice. Inside was a legal document from the HOA, listing new fines he supposedly owed. $5,000 for non-compliant fencing, his wooden farm fence. $3,000 for unauthorized structures, his barn. $2,000 for excessive noise, his livestock. $4,500 for failure to maintain aesthetic property standards. A grand total of $14,500. Ethan laughed. Actually laughed out loud. She really thought she could fine him into submission. A few hours later, Karen appeared at his farm in person, standing at his fence with her usual smug expression. "I assume you received the notice," she said, voice laced with artificial sweetness. Ethan folded his arms. "I did. And I assume you know this fine is complete nonsense, seeing as I'm not in your HOA." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Your property borders our community, which means it affects our property values. That gives us the right to ensure that our surroundings meet our standards." Ethan let out a low whistle. That's some Olympic-level mental gymnastics right there. Karen's patience was wearing thin. "Ignoring this fine will only escalate matters, Mr. Walker. If you don't comply, we'll be forced to take legal action." Ethan grinned. "You keep threatening lawyers like I don't have one. Good luck with that." Karen's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." "No, Karen," Ethan shot back. You are, Her nostrils flared as she turned and stormed off. Ethan watched her go, his mind already working through his next move. Because now, it wasn't just about defending himself. It was time to start pushing back. Ethan knew Karen wasn't bluffing. She had already proven she would go to any length to drive him off his own land, and after their last encounter, he figured she was planning her next move. He just didn't expect it to happen so fast. The next morning, Ethan was working on repairing a section of his fence when he spotted something strange, a county official pulling up to his property in a government-marked vehicle. The man stepped out, carrying a thick file of paperwork, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Walker," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I'm Greg Saunders with the County Zoning Board. We received a petition regarding the classification of your land." Ethan's stomach tightened. "A petition?" Saunders cleared his throat, flipping through the paperwork. "It seems that your property has been flagged for rezoning due to non-compliance with updated county regulations. If approved, it will no longer qualify as agricultural land." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Let me guess, someone from the HOA filed that petition." Saunders hesitated, shifting his weight, and Ethan knew he was right. "If this goes through," Saunders continued, avoiding his gaze, "your land would be designated for residential development. Keeping livestock, selling produce, and operating as a farm would be prohibited." Ethan clenched his fists. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore, this was Karen's endgame. She wasn't trying to fine him. She wasn't just harassing him. She was trying to steal his land. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "And how, exactly, does that work?" "Because my farm has been here for over 100 years. You can't just wake up one day and decide it's not a farm anymore." The official sighed. "If the county determines that your land is impacting surrounding property values or doesn't meet environmental standards, they have the authority to reclassify it." There it was. Karen's fingerprints were all over this. Ethan crossed his arms. "And let me guess, the complaint came with some so-called evidence of my impact on the community?" Saunders hesitated before nodding. "Yes. There were concerns about water contamination, excessive waste runoff, and," he looked back at the report, "possible structural hazards on your property." Ethan exhaled through his nose. This was a coordinated attack. That night, he met with Rachel to go over his options. His lawyer wasn't surprised. "I had a feeling she'd pull something like this," she said, flipping through the paperwork. "But she made one mistake." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And that is?" Rachel smirked. "She left a paper trail." Rachel dug deeper, and within 2 days, she found proof that Karen had been working directly with a county official, one who just so happened to receive a discounted property offer in Oak Estates around the same time the rezoning petition was filed. It was a bribe. Ethan wasted no time sending the information to a local journalist, and the next morning, the scandal broke wide open. HOA president attempts to rezone historic farm, county official under investigation. The backlash was immediate. The county official was removed from his position, and Karen, of course, played the victim. "This is nothing but a misunderstanding," she told reporters, her usual fake smile plastered on her face. "I was simply advocating for the best interests of the community." But the cracks were starting to show. HOA members began questioning her leadership, and Mark Caldwell, one of the more reasonable homeowners, took it upon himself to speak out. "This is not what we signed up for," he told a small gathering of neighbors. "She's using our HOA money, our community name, and our time to push a personal vendetta. It's time we start talking about new leadership." Karen caught wind of the growing rebellion and went into full damage control mode. She sent out an emergency HOA newsletter, spinning the story to make it seem like Ethan was the real problem, a stubborn outsider refusing to cooperate with the greater good. She accused him of being aggressive, threatening legal action against the community, and endangering the safety of Oak Estates. And then, she made one more desperate move. One morning, Ethan walked out to his mailbox and found an official lawsuit notice. Karen, under the banner of the HOA, was suing him. The claims were absurd. Environmental hazards due to farm waste runoff. Structural safety violations for his century-old barn. Public nuisance complaints from unidentified residents. And at the bottom of the document, a demand for $250,000 in damages. Ethan had to laugh. This woman was truly delusional. But he wasn't going to take the lawsuit lightly. He handed it over to Rachel, who took one look at the papers and rolled her eyes. "This is a scare tactic," she said. "She has no legal grounds, but she's hoping the pressure will make you back down." Ethan smirked. "Yeah. Well, she doesn't know who she's dealing with." Rachel leaned back. "Then let's hit her where it hurts." The next morning, Ethan called up a structural inspector, a certified engineer who could officially certify that his barn was up to code and safe. Within a day, he had a notarized report proving there were no violations, no hazards, and no reason for demolition. Then he printed multiple copies and stapled them all over his property. Right on the barn door. On the fence posts along the HOA border. Even taped to his mailbox. At the bottom of each, he scrawled a sarcastic note. "For HOA spies, my barn is fine. Move along." Karen must have lost her mind when she saw it, because the next morning, she made her most outrageous move yet. She organized a mob. Ethan had just finished feeding the chickens when he heard the noise, **** voices, shuffling footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of a crowd gathering outside his fence, ***. He walked up the gravel driveway and stopped short. At least 24 HOA members were standing there, holding signs. ***, save Oak Estates. Rezone the farm. Protect our homes, ***. And at the front of the crowd, wearing a self-satisfied smirk, stood Karen. "This land doesn't belong to one man," she declared, raising her voice like she was leading a revolution. ***, it belongs to the community, ***. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He pulled out his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Yeah," he said, watching the crowd with an amused expression. I've got a bunch of trespassers holding a midnight protest outside my property. Looks like a HOA stunt gone wrong. The dispatcher promised to send officers. Ethan chuckled. Karen had seriously underestimated who she was messing with. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness as the sheriff's deputies pulled up outside Ethan's farm. The moment the siren started wailing, the so-called protest lost its steam. Some of the HOA members started shuffling back toward the sidewalk, murmuring amongst themselves. A few had the decency to look embarrassed. Others, the more die-hard Karen loyalists, stood their ground, gripping their ridiculous homemade signs like they were leading a historic movement. Karen, of course, wasn't backing down. "This is a peaceful demonstration," she shouted the moment the first deputy stepped out of his cruiser. "We have a right to express our concerns about this hazard to our community." She waved a hand toward Ethan's farm, as if pointing out a toxic waste site instead of a perfectly legal, fully operational farm that had been there for generations. Ethan leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching the whole thing unfold like it was free entertainment. The officer, a middle-aged man who looked like he had no patience for suburban nonsense, sighed and looked around. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you and your group to disperse. It's nearly midnight, you're trespassing, and you're causing a disturbance." Karen's face twisted in indignation. "Trespassing? We are on public land." The officer's gaze flicked toward the private property, no HOA jurisdiction sign Ethan had put up weeks ago, then back at Karen. "The road is public," he said evenly. "But when you're standing on the man's driveway, blocking access, and chanting like a cult leader in the middle of the night, yeah, that's a problem." A few HOA members looked like they were ready to bail, but Karen doubled down. "I demand you do something about this farm," she snapped, pointing an accusing finger at Ethan. "It's an eyesore, it's a biohazard, and it is devaluing every single home in Oak Estates." The officer didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, I suggest you go home before we start issuing citations." Karen's confident smirk flickered just a little. Ethan could tell she wanted to argue, but she wasn't stupid enough to get arrested tonight. She let out a dramatic huff, turned to her crowd, and declared, "We'll continue this fight at the next HOA meeting." And just like that, she stomped off, her remaining followers scrambling after her like a flock of lost ducklings. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. Unbelievable. He turned to the officer. "Want some eggs? Fresh from the farm." The deputy chuckled. "Tempting, but I've got paperwork to do. Have a good night, Mr. Walker." As the last car pulled away, Ethan stood in the quiet of his property, looking out at the fields that Karen had fought so hard to take from him. She was losing. And she knew it. But she wasn't finished yet. The next morning, Ethan received a thick envelope from a law firm representing Oak Estates. He didn't even have to open it to know what it was, **** Karen's latest stunt, ***. He skimmed the first few pages, eyebrows raising at the legal jargon. According to this, Ethan was being accused of environmental violations, community disruption, and failure to comply with neighborhood beautification standards. The kicker? The letter threatened legal action if he didn't agree to their demands, which included removing his barn within 30 days, reducing his livestock numbers to a HOA-approved limit, eliminating all noxious farm odors, installing an HOA-approved fence. Ethan let out a slow whistle. She was actually trying to sue him into submission. That night, he called Rachel, who tore through the documents like a wolf. "This is complete garbage," she muttered, flipping pages. "They don't have any actual legal standing. This is just a scare tactic to get you to settle and comply." Ethan smirked. "Then let's hit them back." The next morning, Rachel drafted a formal response, outlining every bogus claim, highlighting the fraudulent nature of Karen's accusations, and issuing a counternotice warning that if Karen or the HOA continued their harassment, Ethan would pursue them for damages. But Karen still wasn't done. The following week, Ethan was out repairing a section of the barn roof when he noticed an unfamiliar truck backing up toward his property. A tow truck. Frowning, he climbed down the ladder and made his way over, just as the driver stepped out, looking uncomfortable. Behind him, standing smugly with her arms crossed, was Karen. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "I'm just here to enforce county standards." Ethan's stomach turned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Karen gestured toward his barn. "This structure has been deemed unsafe. I filed a structural hazard report with the county, and since you failed to act, we're moving forward with removal." Ethan laughed out loud. "You think you can just send a tow truck to tear down my barn?" Karen smiled. "Yes. And the county agrees." The tow truck driver cleared his throat awkwardly. Sir, I have an official order to remove any condemned structures." Ethan's amusement vanished. His jaw clenched. He pulled a folder from under his arm and flipped it open. "I thought you might try something like this," he said, handing the driver a notarized structural report. "This is from a licensed engineer who inspected this barn last week." The driver read the document, eyes widening. Karen's face turned pale. That's not. That's illegal, county-approved document, Ethan interrupted. "Which means your order is invalid." The tow truck driver didn't need more convincing. He handed the report back, turned to Karen, and muttered, "Yeah, I'm not touching this." Karen looked like she wanted to explode. "You're making a huge mistake, Walker." "No, Karen," Ethan said, watching the truck pull away. You already did, The next morning, the final blow landed. Ethan woke up to find a group of people walking around inside his property. Strangers. A real estate agent leading prospective buyers. He stormed over. "What the hell is going on here?" The agent blinked, adjusting his tie. "Sir, I'm just here to show the land. It's listed for auction." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What? Auction?" The agent hesitated. "According to our records, this property is being foreclosed due to unpaid HOA fines." Ethan laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "Let me guess. Karen gave you those records?" The agent paled. "Yes." Ethan exhaled through his nose. That was it. Karen had officially crossed the line. Because now, she wasn't just filing complaints. She had committed fraud. Ethan wasted no time. Within the hour, Rachel had filed a formal complaint with the county, and by noon, the sheriff's department was knocking on Karen's door. The real estate agent, now realizing he had been duped, backed off immediately. But the damage was done. Karen had falsified legal documents, fabricated foreclosure notices, and attempted to sell land that didn't belong to her. That wasn't just harassment. That was fraud. By the end of the week, Karen was in handcuffs. It was almost poetic, the way the entire community turned against her the moment she was no longer in control. The same HOA members who had followed her orders for months were suddenly acting like they had no idea how things had gotten so out of hand. The county pressed multiple charges, including real estate fraud, forgery, and falsification of legal records. Karen tried to blame the HOA board, but the board had already begun the process of distancing itself from her. Then came the final blow: she was forced to sell her house. Turns out, she had been funneling HOA funds to cover her legal battles and personal expenses, which meant that not only was she broke, but the new HOA leadership, now under Tom Jenkins, was suing her to recover the lost money. Facing mounting legal fees and zero allies left in Oak Estates, Karen had no choice but to put her house on the market and leave town. Ethan watched the moving trucks pull away from a distance, arms crossed, letting out a long, slow breath. It was over. No more complaints. No more surprise inspections. No more midnight protests and ridiculous fines. His farm was his again. But he wasn't about to let people forget who had tried to steal it from him. A few days later, a brand new sign appeared along the edge of his property, right where Oak Estates began. In bold letters, it read, "Private property, now Karen-free zone." Even Tom Jenkins, the new HOA president, had to admit it was deserved. As the months passed, the HOA quietly removed Karen's absurd policies. Fees went down. The ridiculous landscaping rules disappeared. And ironically, some of the very same HOA members who had once tried to force Ethan out of his own land, they started buying produce from his farm. Ethan had won. Not just for himself, but for everyone Karen had bullied along the way. He had stood his ground, fought back, and refused to let a power-hungry HOA destroy everything he had built. But Karen's story? It wasn't unique. HOAs across the country have a reputation for overreach, abuse of power, and ridiculous regulations that make life miserable for homeowners. So, the real question is, have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.